Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station that you are tuned into, and my name is Andy, and I'll be hanging out with you for the next hour, broadcasting on Jagera and Turrbal country here in Magunjan, Brisbane. And today on the show, we're going to be delving a bit into Aboriginal history in this city, and we're going to be talking about the life story of an extremely significant figure that maybe hasn't always had as much recognition as he deserves. Well, that's what his son Graham thinks anyway. So part of the reason of this new book called Yalanya about Kawanji Don Brady is to try to fix that up. And so I spoke to historian Thom Blake, who has authored the book along with some of Don Brady's family. And it tells an incredible story of somebody who, born on Palm Island and trained as a religious pastor who then became an extremely significant Aboriginal activist in the early days of kind of the Black Power movement, and also had a very, very strong cultural influence in trying to maintain traditional Aboriginal cultures when other people weren't doing that so much. So it is really super interesting, and so I will speak with Thom Blake, historian, and at the end we'll hear a bit from Graham Brady, Kawanji's son. So stick around. It is a great story. I do occasionally do these history shows on the Paradigm Shift, and I think it's so illuminating, to know where we've come from, how we got to where we are, and also opens up other possibilities for thinking about the future. Once we realise that the present didn't just happen, that people in the past were active in forging our world into what it is, then it makes us think about how we might want to forge the future. And so, great to do another history show. And we've got quite a bit of talking, so we'll get straight into it with my chat with Thom Blake.
Thom Blake, I'm a historian, and I've had an interest in Aboriginal Indigenous history for a long time. And this book, Yalanya, on the Brady family, I've assisted with research and writing that publication for the family.
Okay, and that is what we're going to be talking about on the show, your new book, Yalanya. Don Brady, Kawanji, is a significant person in Brisbane Aboriginal history, but he hasn't had a book written about him before. And so how did this one come about?
Well, it was a long process in a sense. His last years were actually quite sad in that he essentially had a breakdown simply because his activities were so intense. And so for his family it was very difficult and for anyone else to sort of tackle his life, and it remained so for virtually another 30 years, more than that, 35 years, and finally a number of years ago the family said, look, we must write the story of our dad, because not many people knew about all the different things he did. And so it really was a collective effort. It was their story of their memories and recollections, and with research from some interesting sources. So that's really how it came about, and it's a story that's long overdue. And it's not just about Kawanji, of course, but it's about the struggles and the movement for Indigenous rights in the late 60s and the early 70s.
Yeah, and it's also a story that goes back longer than that. I guess in some ways that era is the beginning of what's really been documented by kind of our mainstream understanding of Aboriginal protests. It's the times before then as well, which Don Brady is involved in, is of real interest because it's really formative in setting up what would later become the sort of national movement of Aboriginal people. And so I guess where should we start with Don Brady? Should we go back to talking about his early life?
Well, even earlier, I think. It goes back really to his father's roots and his grandfather's roots, they were Kawanji people from the Palmer River in North Queensland. And their experiences are really, really important of understanding actually Don Brady himself, because the Kawanji occupied basically their area was the Palmer River, and in the early 1870s their country was invaded by no less than 17,000 plus miners, a huge invasion. And this has never really been written before, because some of the popular sort of accounts of what happened on the Palmer River was these massive sort of battles, etc. But when you actually look at the contemporary sources, it wasn't anything like that. But you had 17,000 miners, and just the Kawanji, probably a group of 400 or 500, and probably 200, 150 sort of able-bodied men against 17,000. And you'd say, look, how could they ever have survived? I mean, you think there's no chance that anyone would have been left if they were confronted by 17,000 plus. But in fact, they did survive. But quite remarkably, in this sort of conflict with the miners, they really, in a sense, came out not unscathed, but certainly as a group intact. And because they used very, very astute guerrilla tactics, they knew the country, very rugged terrain, so they were never easy targets for the miners. In fact, they had the miners often scared, so much so that contemporary reports said, and I think this is very, very significant, it said the blacks are bold and cannot be intimidated. Now that's an extraordinary admission. You think, how could 150 be not intimidated by 17,000? They weren't, because they used these brilliant guerrilla tactics of just creating fear, spearing a horse here or a bullock here. And so that really was always in their culture, but that continued down, their sense of identity, people that were never intimidated and were always bold. So that was passed on to Don's father, Jack, who was removed from the area in 1920 and went to Palm Island. And clearly that sense of very clear about who he was and where they were from was very much part of his identity, and he very much clearly imparted that to Don himself on Palm Island. When so many other people there had lost that connection with their country, they had come from areas that were pretty defeated and demoralised, but not Don Brady and his family.
Yeah, well, Palm Island, I guess, is an interesting part of Australian history too. A lot of people were moved from their country to different missions, but Palm Island, as I understand it, was sort of a half mission, half prison kind of settlement. Is that right?
Well, I guess if we make a little bit of a distinction, that missions run by churches, settlements basically run by the government. And so this was just a government settlement. I mean, colloquially it's talked about Punishment Island. It was a brutal place to be, and more than anything else, what happened on Palm and Cherbourg and Warrabinda, the main government settlements, it was systematically tried to destroy people's identity. People were treated as second-class, third-class citizens. They grew up with this sense of punishment, but inferiority in every way, and that was, as you can imagine, sort of so demoralising. But Thom, what he inherited from his father was always, stand tall, be bold. And of course he left there when he was 20, and but I guess the important thing is that on Palm, despite this sort of very cruel regime in many ways, he still, as it was imparted from his dad in particular, this sense of who he was and where he was from. And his father always used to say to him, "I can never go back to my country, but you must, Don," which was a pretty remarkable thing to say, actually, to someone on Palm Island like that. Because for so many people, they'd been just so crushed and never ever thought that they could ever go back, or even their offspring could go back.
In the end, his journey away from Palm Island was led by his Christian faith and his sense of calling to be a minister to Aboriginal people. I guess when we look back and see him as a kind of activist, but he was also a religious leader. What role do you think in his life's journey did this faith play?
Oh, look, it was very important, and always very important. And the interesting thing is, when in the Methodist Church he seemed to be overstepping the mark of what it meant to be a pastor or a minister. As he said, he was also always being absolutely what he would say is true to the gospel, that you must stand up for injustice. You must stand up for the poor and the broken. You must stand, for the disadvantaged. So it was always in him, and very much a driver in all that he did throughout his whole life.
So his missionary training took place in New South Wales, did it? And it sent him around a lot of the country. He would have seen a lot more of Australia than most Aboriginal people at the time. Can you tell us a bit about that, his process of being ordained and things?
Yeah, it is interesting, yeah. His first appointment was to Bawarrina in far western New South Wales, numbers of places in New South Wales, and then, well, let me go back one step and about his training, and this is very interesting. I mean, it's very easy to criticise these what would be seen as fundamentalist Christian organisations, the Aboriginal New Zealand Mission, and they were very fundamentalist in many ways and looked down on Aboriginal culture. But in his training, it's very interesting. So he went to New South Wales, and he was the only student in this college for 2 years. So he had undivided attention from one or two tutors. So obviously he got theological training and biblical training, but it just improved his sort of literacy skills no end, his public speaking skills no end. So it was really invaluable, what he learned in that college. I doubt whether there's anyone else, in the 40s or 50s, an Aboriginal person would have had 2 years of training with undivided attention. So that was very interesting. But he found then being a missionary, it was hard, and unfortunately he was really left to his own resources. And it was just incredibly difficult for him, and so he ultimately fell out of favour with the Aboriginal mission. Then he was left sort of just working as a labourer. It was very disheartening for him, actually.
I remember speaking to you while in the process of writing the book, and you told a story about him being central to bringing the didgeridoo or the yidaki into a lot of Aboriginal communities. Can you tell us a bit more about that story?
Yeah, well, again, it's interesting about this mix about his sort of involvement in Christian organisations. So he, in 1964, he came to Brisbane from Kingaroy to study part-time at a Methodist training college at Kangaroo Point. Now, again, it was sort of Bible training, theological training, etc. But at the college, there were people from Arnhem Land, Papua New Guinea, the Pacific Island. So it was quite a multicultural environment. But the people from Arnhem Land, he really did befriend them. And they asked him to come and visit them sometime at Yurikala in northeast Arnhem Land, which he did. And he was introduced to the Didge. And he tell the story that there was a competition about playing the Didge, and he won it. And then he brought one back to Brisbane. So whether he was the very first one, probably was. But the other thing about him in the Didge is that he was an incredibly gifted musician. And that was, evident in his capacity to play the didge, but he could play the cornet. We know that. He could play the piano. He could play the organ. He really did have a wonderful musical ear. So that's how he kind of came to bring the uke or the didge back to Brisbane anyhow in the 67, 68.
That is an extraordinary cultural influence besides anything else he ever did in his life. If that's true, that he sort of popularised the didgeridoo for the most of Aboriginal Australia, that's an incredible cultural contribution, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yeah. But it's not the only one. That's the thing about this guy. You think, oh, well, that's an amazing end of story, But there were so many things he just really pioneered. I mean, the other thing, I would think in one sense probably more important, was dance, with what he called the Yalungi Dance Company. And when he started that, it was just basically with his family and cousins. And his son Graham tells the story when they first started dancing. Other Aboriginal people didn't like it. Oh, shame, that's old stuff. We don't want any of this old culture. And so they were ridiculed. But then, of course, there were others that liked it. And of course, what happened to that? They were basically the only, in the early 70s, the only Aboriginal dance company group in Eastern Australia, because they got invitations to dance in Sydney. They danced before Gough Whitlam when he was Prime Minister, went to Canberra, Melbourne, South Australia. That was really the impetus for the revival of dance in Eastern Australia. And that was, I think, again, that story alone is an extraordinary accomplishment.
Yeah, in your course of researching the book, did you try to find other records of other people who were maybe playing the didgeridoo or dancing in the years before he brought it back?
Well, look, in terms of dance, we're pretty confident that they were the only ones. I think it's by the absence. I mean, if there were dance groups in Sydney in 1972, they wouldn't have been asked to go and dance as a precursor to the production of Cake Man. They would have been asked to go and dance before Gough Whitlam at Old Sydney Town. If there were other dance groups, they would have been hauled all the way down to Canberra to dance at the opening of the new theatre at Australian National University. In terms of the didgeridoo, look, I guess the thing about this book, it opens up so many avenues of research, and certainly didn't pursue that even more rigorously, the thing about the didge. But I guess that's kind of, we think, he probably was really the first to, at least in Eastern Australia, because very much it's an instrument from the Northern Territory.
Yeah, and talking about his musical legacy, his children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren also are all performing musicians, aren't they?
Say no more, say no more. I mean, it was really interesting at the book launch. At the end, there was a group of people came out to dance, and all of them were the Brady family.
So, in his life story, we've got up to, he's moved to Brisbane, and he took up more Methodist training. He became a pastor in West End and in Spring Hill, where there are a lot of sort of displaced Aboriginal people. That's correct, yes. And what influence did he have in that time? I guess before he became a prominent political activist in the late 60s and 70s, what was he doing as a minister in Brisbane?
Well, a whole range of things, Certainly he would go and visit Aboriginal people wherever they were, in parks, whatever. He'd invite people back to his house if they needed a meal or a bed. And that was constantly, they were putting up people in their house at Paddington in Warmington Street. He set up a workshop in an old Methodist church at Red Hill, where he could train people in making curios. That was another one. Another one of his things was he was very skilled at making artefacts, which again he would have learnt those skills when he was on Palm Island. But he's very keen to teach that, and it's interesting about this kind of interesting curio making. When he was living outside Kingaroy at a place called Memorambi, the family was just living in this farm shed, basically dirt floor. But the kids went to the Memorandum State School. And when he enrolled his children, he had to say what his occupation was, and he said curio maker. And I'm thinking, in all the records of sort of school enrolments, he's probably the only curio maker in Queensland. But that was him, you know. So in here, so just that was a digression. But what he was doing, so he's teaching curio making. He was teaching sport boxing. He was a boxer himself in his younger days. So he had boxing classes at this church at Red Hill. He was just doing a whole lot of range of activities.
And during this time, he picked up the nickname that he was forever then associated with, the punching pastor. So partly this was because he was training young kids for box to get kids off the street and things. But were there other instances where he was required to do a bit of punching?
Well, there's this story that there was some kids playing up somewhere. Not that he knocked 6 of them out, but some of them. So, you know, but I guess it was in reality, he didn't go around punching people any day of the week. Having said that, at times, you know, he would get extremely angry at the way Aboriginal people were being treated. And there's a story that when he was in the West End church, he had to go to the Department of Native Affairs office, and this minister went with him, and Don was being treated appallingly, and the officer was really difficult, and this minister that was with Don remembers that Don was just about ready to clock him, you know. So yeah.
Yes, well, he was apparently, I've heard firsthand from people that he was quite fearless with police later on when they started doing kind of street marches and things.
Oh, sure. Yeah, he never took a backward step. And there's this other funny incident at one demonstration, an anti-apartheid demonstration. There was a couple of Nazi protesters there, and they were sort of yelling abuse. And he yells out, "I'd be happy to do 3 months just to knock your block off, boys." But apparently that quietened them down.
Before we go on to talking about his later activism, I guess I find it quite interesting, these sort of cultural contributions that he made, that in some ways he was involved in keeping alive traditional cultures through dancing and making artefacts, things which have become very significant since then for Aboriginal people in recovering their sense of identity. But also he mixed it in with these things that he was linked with the church, and he started up a gymnasium, you know, these sort of parts of the white culture. It's quite an interesting balance that he walked, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yes. I mean, you could say he could walk those two cultures, very astutely, yes. He was extremely astute with that.
So as the 1960s ended, I guess there's a change all around the world in kind of political consciousness at this time of the new left and black power and protests against the Vietnam War and things like that. And is this a point where Don gets kind of politicised along with so many other people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I guess a real turning point was he had a Churchill Fellowship. Again, he was the first Aboriginal person to get a Churchill Fellowship, in Australia. And I always think when he put that application in, I mean, he would have thought, he's got Buckley's and none of getting this. I mean, here am I, a black fella, I don't have any education, and he got it. It was amazing. And I think particularly going to the United States really did open his eyes, because there was plenty of protests going on when he did, but very critically visiting sort of a couple of reservations there and seeing the importance of self-determination, how that was actually working out. So when he came back, he said, bang, I've seen a new thing, and this is the way forward. So that really was the turning point for him in many ways.
So what kind of things did he become involved in? This is a sort of a beginning of a new era of Aboriginal activism that he's around for. What were the kind of projects?
Well, I think that really the critical thing was the establishment of the Brisbane Tribal Council. He came back when And it was just extraordinary how these sort of events came together, that while he'd been away, some people have been talking about we need to set up this truly independent Aboriginal organisation, not an organisation that white fellas are in it and part of it and often have the final say, but it must be a black organisation to control black affairs. And so I would argue that the Brisbane Tribal Council was one of the most significant events in First Nations history in Queensland, as significant as the 1897 Act. You could say as significant as the referendum in 67, as significant as the Mabo decision, because this was an absolute turning point. No more white control. And it was early on very successful. It accomplished that aim, in a sense, of showing that, Aboriginal people, black people could control black affairs, and they did it very well. So he, along with a number, other people, Dennis Walker, Kath Walker, Lenny Watson, the Cheryl Buchanan, it goes on and on and on. So that was really a turning point for him, but for the whole of First Nations people in Queensland, I suggest.
And there's a famous picture, the iconic image of him is him leading this walk. It's mostly sort of older, grey-haired looking white people in the background, but him looking very staunch in his ministerial robes. And so he was leading street demonstrations and things like that.
Well, it was the first one. It was the first, Aboriginal street march ever. I mean, it's interesting. A few years ago, and I think it was 2019, at an Invasion Day rally, Sammy Watson alluded to this march. He said, in 2019, what we're doing now all started with Pastor Don Brady in 1970. Of course, it was very significant, and audacious and bold. I mean, it's hard to imagine how significant, because, we have street marches every day of the week or every second day of the week. We're so ho-hum about them. But this was the first. It had been never done before. Never been done before. So that was just absolutely remarkable.
And around this time as well, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was set up in Canberra, and it was one of the significant moments. And Don went down there to visit it?
He did. Yes, he did. Possibly not right at the beginning, but at various stages. Yes, it was all part of this movement. I mean, I think the other thing to say about Don establishing or being an instrumental person in establishing the tribal... I mean, again, all of these things were collective efforts, but, he certainly was very influential and seen as the leader. But the other thing that he did in 1970 was Brisbane Tribal Council was set up. He went to Palm Island on a fact-finding mission for the Tribal Council, came back to Townsville to a public meeting to discuss the Act. And of course, people talked about how difficult it was to live under the Act. And then he went outside and he spat on and burnt the Act. Well, you can imagine how that went down. It was a very provocative event.
Yeah, and it did become a big part of Aboriginal politics over, up until the 80s, was then abolishing the Act, wasn't it?
It was, yes. But the point is that he had a great sense of theatre, in a sense, how to capture attention. I mean, if that meeting in Townsville, if they had a meeting, the Act must go, no one would have taken any notice. But boy, did they start standing up now. It really shone the headlights on the Act. And so really from then, okay, they didn't change the Act in 1971, but it galvanised sort of, a whole range of groups to speak out about the Act. And people were speaking out, wanting it in Parliament. In the Queensland Parliament was saying the Act should be abolished. Certainly in the federal Parliament, in the Senate, Senator George. Before Don did what he did, people thought, oh, well, it's the Act, maybe it's okay, but not really too bad. But it just sort of shone the light on just how grievous it was.
That is a little clip there of Kawanji Don Brady himself playing the didgeridoo and introducing a dance. That one, there's not much footage of him actually that I could find, but that is from the Nimbin Aquarius Festival, a little portable camera footage that's on the National Film and Sound Archive. And another interesting, I guess, cultural contribution of Don Brady and that Nimbus Aquarius Festival is famous for being the first event in this country, as far as anybody knows, organised by white people, where they asked for Aboriginal local traditional owners to come and give a welcome to country. Of course, Don Brady was not an Aboriginal traditional owner there at Nimbin on Bundjalung country, but he came down and also did some dances and performed at the festival. He was there for so many significant moments. And of course, as we heard earlier, the didgeridoo, Don did a lot to popularise it on the East Coast. This instrument, this wonderful traditional instrument, indigenous instrument to this land, and so many cultural contributions that Don Brady made. I'm just going to go to the last part of our interview with Thom Blake now, talking about Kawanji. At the time, Queensland was under the power of Joe Bjelke-Petersen and by all reports was an extremely conservative place. I mean, what was the public perception and, say, response from the National Party and things like that to Don Brady's growing influence and fame?
Well, you can answer that. That's easy. They didn't like it, So in Parliament, he was, accused of being, out of touch. One of these out-of-touch Aboriginal people. Yes, he quickly fell out of favour with the National Party and the government. He was, their arch enemy. And of course, as a consequence, he had an ASIO file. From as soon as basically when the Brisbane Tribal Council was started, bang, they opened a file on him.
Did you get access to the file as part of your research for the book?
Indeed, we did. Yes. Very, very illuminating, yes. I think one of the interesting things about it is when you read all through it, you think, well, so much of it was so benign and ridiculous, like we saw Don Brady walking through the grounds of the University of Queensland on Wednesday, the 3rd of March at 3 p.m. with, Dan O'Neill, things like that, it was just... But at the end of the day, they really couldn't lay specifically how he could have been a threat to national security. That's one of the most interesting things. I mean, they reported on speeches he's made and rallies he was at. Of course, photographed him numbers of times, but at the end of the day, they couldn't say much about him.
They were probably recording things more scrupulously than most people, though. Was it a good source for the book?
Oh, look, where it was a good source, in a sense, yes, it just gave some different insights that other documents didn't give, or things, particularly rallies he went to in the mid-70s, that there was no other sort of source about that. But, they would list everyone that attended a rally in 1974 at King George Square, and it would report what he said as well. So it was useful to pierce some parts of his life that really we didn't know much about or could track down. So yes, it was very illuminating.
The historian's friend, ASIO. Okay, so during this period, he's gaining a lot of notoriety and probably controversy, and so it did bring him into conflict with the leadership of the Methodist Church, and I understand that his ministerial credentials were taken away off him at some time around here.
That's correct, yeah, in 1972. Yeah, I mean, part of the excuse was he was working was the Wesley Central Mission, and George Nash was the superintendent minister. He was actually very supportive of Don, right through it all, actually, but the board of management weren't. Well, their excuse, in reality, he was a great embarrassment. I mean, they were extremely conservative, and having this pastor getting arrested and being in the limelight, thinking associated with black power, they just couldn't cope with that. But their excuse was, look, he's costing us too much money. He's run up these huge telephone bills. But they never asked, well, how is that money being spent? And he was always helping people, and bygone days when you could reverse charges, someone could ring you and you would pay for the call. There was always people like that. So they just didn't know how to cope. And with him, and also there's a sense he was finding it more and more difficult to cope with so much pressure on him from every which way. People coming to his doorstep, being asked to speak at rallies all around Australia, the Brisbane Tribal Council, the Black Panther movement was, becoming more prominent, and he was having to deal with those complex issues. So it just became too much for him in a sense.
Yeah, and you said it led to a breakdown. What was the psychological effect on him of having his church credentials taken away? I mean, you said that his faith was always a driving force. Was it a difficult process?
It was absolutely devastating for him. It was absolutely devastating because his whole identity was in being a pastor. Now, it might have been that he wasn't doing that very effectively, but the church just didn't know how to respond effectively in this situation. I mean, today they would do it very differently, but it was just devastating for him. He was a shattered man after it. It was very tragic.
Yeah, and he died quite early in 1984. I understand he was quite young still. What were the last years of his life like?
Well, he'd had strokes, so he was more or less an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. Yeah, it was very sad. I mean, it was sad for him, very sad for his family, very difficult for his family. A tragedy of someone who once was so energetic and inspiring, had a profound influence on so many people, and it was very, very sad.
Yeah. And what about, you mentioned at the beginning that his father had told him on Palm Island, make sure you get back to Guyalanji country. It's a long way from Brisbane, but did he make it back up to his country?
He did indeed. In 1979, he did go back, yes. And that was significant. He went back with a couple of anthropologists, but he went back to see his uncle and some other relatives, an uncle in Mariba, and people that had incredibly deep knowledge of the country, and they recorded numbers of sites. So that was a very significant event, yes, and a long time before anyone else basically was doing that. After Mabo, of course, people started to reconnect in so many different places to country, but he'd done it again. He was a leader, a pioneer.
Yeah, and well, you've been a part of writing down his story, I guess, to try to make sense of his legacy and continue it by writing it down. What do you feel is the legacy that Don Brady leaves?
You could almost sum it up in one or two words. This is what his daughter-in-law said. He made blackfellas proud of who they are. He made them proud of their Aboriginality when it was unfashionable to be Aboriginal. That almost sums it up. That's what he did. He was always proud of who he was. He was always bold, and he was never intimidated.
All right, thanks very much for chatting with us, Tom. If people are interested in getting a hold of the book, how can they do that? Two places.
Avid Reader in West End, and the State Library Bookshop are also stocking it as well. So, yep, relatively available.
All right, thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks, Andy.
Kawanji certainly was somebody who stood very strong and proud for his culture and faced all the difficulties that come with that and with being a trailblazer in doing that. And what an extraordinary story it is. As Tom said at the end there, you can get the book. It's called Yalanya, which was a Guyalanji word that he used to use a bit. It means that's the way it is. Now, we've got a little bit left of the show, and I did speak to Don's son Graham, who helped make the book as well. Let's have a listen to Graham talking about the importance of making this book.
Yeah, my name's Graham Brady. I live up in Cairns, Guyalanji descent, and Kalali descent.
And we are talking about your father, Don Brady, today on the show because there's just been a book written, Yalanya, about him, but also he's got quite an extraordinary story to tell. Can you tell us, for you and your family, what did it mean to have this book written and tell your father's story?
Well, one of the main things that occurred to us, as not so much as a family, but people around us, it actually broadened out to people around, saying, old Dad's story has to be told. Everybody else's story is being out there, and because Dad had such a great impact back in the 60s, 70s and 80s, nobody hardly knows about him. But when we see clips shown on various media, they're like TV or ABC, his image seems to pop up everywhere, and we're thinking, why are people using Dad's image and not even mentioning him? So there was a discussion a good few years ago that people were saying to us, hey, look, your father's story got to be told. He made such an impact all those years, with what we benefit from today. So we as a family, we got together to try and sort this out. How are we going to tell the story? What's going to be in the story? And we had to compact it in such a way that we couldn't, really go out and tell the whole scope. The whole scope being there was many different avenues that Dad took, and all along the way, Mum was there with him, as a quiet supporter, and just quietly there was many others that surrounded Dad and his efforts, but he spearheaded a lot of things, such as the services that we have today, and also the revival of our culture, because that was being neglected, especially around the 60s and 70s. Nobody was really, it wasn't in the frame of having to perform, as tourism operation or having to perform at different places of interest. It was mainly to do with the Aboriginal people themselves, because, why are you neglecting your culture? Your culture means a lot to you because it's an identifying marker. And it was sad I call it sad, but it was a government initiative that brought about native title, and then everybody went and started looking for their ancestry. Why did it take the government to promote things like that? When Dad was saying that way back in the 60s, you got everybody knew there was language speakers back then, and there was people who was holders of traditional knowledge. And Dad tried to. It was mainly in the urban areas. Forget about territory, centre. They weren't impacted like the coast, because a lot of people live along the coast, the coastal areas, the fringes of the coast, and just in the hinterlands. And it's mainly in the cities where all this was being neglected. So Dad was part of all this type of restructuring and rethought among our people. So that's what prompted us. We better tell his story.
Yeah. It's well known around the world that kids of church ministers like your dad often have a hard time growing up because there's so many external demands on, their father. And it would have been much more so for your dad, who was such a important figure, and there weren't many other people like him. What was it like growing up with him as a father?
Well, old Dad was very strict with us. Strict in the sense that he made sure that we adhere to family values. Like in general, we all grow up, and because of society itself, how society rearranges family structures, especially with what happened on the missions and reserves, how they decimated a lot of family structures. Well, Dad tried to maintain that within our family structure, is that, because of this upheaval within our family structure, there was this misconception. You sort of pushed your family understanding aside, and it was mainly because living conditions were very harsh. And you only could concentrate on your immediate family, not your wider family. But Dad maintained that we understand who we are, where we're from. Always remember that you from these people, and this is the beauty of it too. We actually were told we go way back to an ancient people. But when I talk about ancient people, Aboriginal people, Australian Aboriginal people don't stand alone. We are related to a vast number of other human beings on the planet. And Dad made that known to us. And because of his religious understanding, mainly through this viewpoint, is that Aboriginal people are spiritual people, finish. Bible come here, we saw an understanding between what was in the Bible and also within our religious and spiritual condition. That was there before Bible come. Dad saw that. That's what attracted him to the Word. That's so common among a lot of our people. We know with British Empire building, how they also used the religious connotations to also go in and free the heathens, tell them of the good news. But the good news already existed here, see? We knew because we're spiritual people. And Dad tried to make that understood with the wider Aboriginal community. We're not just standalone people. We are actually a part of a big human race of people. And that's the spiritual values that he took on as a pastor.
Yeah. One of the things that came up when I spoke to Thom Blake was that your father was very musical and a lot of his descendants have been very musical. Was that something that he intentionally tried to pass on to you?
Well, the beauty with music is universal, see? And all human beings are musical-orientated people. And that was built in our family. And because Dad, he was multi-talented, actually. He could play the organ, he could play the guitar, banjo, mandolin, what else? Second cornet, the trumpet, the second tenor horn. Because he was around a lot of other musical Aboriginal people growing up on Palm Island, that all this musical interest, really captivated him. And he passed that on to us. So we're a musical family too, but that music also stemmed back to the understanding of ceremony and songman, songline, and they're all connected together through music and performance. So we carried that since the 60s in the cultural revitalization. He started internally within the family to make sure he builds us up to understand our identity, but musically and creatively and ceremonially, this was built into us.
All right, thanks very much, Graham.
Thank you, Andy.
That is Graham Brady there, talking about why they got together to make a book to tell their father's story. And the legacy lives on, obviously, in the political work that he pioneered that's still going on, the cultural work in trying to revive some of those traditional cultures and trying to cultivate a pride in Aboriginality. And so Don Brady, he might have died in 1984, but his life is still giving to so many people across this country. I hope you've enjoyed the story of Kawanji Don Brady on the show today, and you can get a copy of that book. You're probably at your local library as well. I'll give a shout out to all the libraries. You can probably find a copy there too. We'll be back next week on Paradigm Shift, and I'll see you then.